Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Vibe podcast. And tonight I'm joined by Dr. Justin Holmes from the Deconstruction Zone. The link to his YouTube channel is tagged in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment after the stream is concluded. And before we get going, Justin, thank you for joining me today.
Hey, I'm happy to be here, although you've already given me too much credit. I'm not a doctor. I got to do my PhD still. But either way, happy to be here, buddy.
Okay. Um, yeah, thank you for joining me. And yeah, so the Epstein files, that's what we're talking about tonight. God is in the Epstein files. And the way I want to frame this is if we assume that the most gory of the allegations, the most horrific of them, turned out to be true. Um, well, uh, people, especially believers, they try to redirect it and say, well, that's all Moloch stuff, Baal stuff, or satanic stuff. The Satan parts is the most ridiculous because nowhere in the entire Bible is Satan ever blamed for that stuff anywhere, literally.
Yeah, not even from God. Not even God blames Satan for wanting to do that kind of stuff.
Right, right. So, Justin, can you take us through some of the passages in the Hebrew Bible that show that actually God was worshipped in those horrific ways that they think that Moloch was worshipped at Epstein Island when they tried to reattribute the atrocities to Moloch?
Oh, for sure. So there's a couple, like, we're gonna say some verses that are for sure where it just flat out states that there's some child sacrifice that either God accepted or even that God demanded. So we can definitely go through that. And then maybe the other thing we want to take a look at is there's some passages in the Hebrew Bible that talk about a type of warfare which some scholars would classify as human sacrifice. And I realize that there would be some disagreement on this. Even some of the scholars are in a little bit of disagreement on whether or not this is in fact human sacrifice or some other type of honor killing. But we're definitely going to look at some passages on harem warfare. I'm sure you're familiar with the terminology. And then maybe look at some of the other stuff, because when we talk about Epstein, there's stuff that they're accused of other than just having intercourse with young ladies. We could talk about like sex slavery, talk about the child sacrifice. We can certainly talk about kidnapping women. All things that I think you'll find that the God of the Bible isn't as against as people might think.
And one example of where the debate lies is in the passage in Ezekiel about Ezekiel makes a reference to a past scenario in which God apparently regrets having the Jews offer their firstborns to him. This seems to also be in accord with a commandment having to do with firstborns in Exodus, um, in which firstborns were offered to Yahweh. And he says, okay, well, these are bad deeds. I regret doing that. Let's not do that anymore. And that's the kind of scenario that you get in Ezekiel. Like, okay, well, I suppose you can interpret it as a partial condemnation because God is portrayed as changing his mind, but it means
Mhm.
at one time he condoned it. What do you do with that part?
Right. It certainly does. And we'll pull up the verse. It's going to be Ezekiel chapter 20. And Ezekiel chapter 20, I think, is riffing on what we find in the book of Exodus. And so when we go to Exodus chapter 13 or 22 is the other one, 13 and 22 mention it, of offering up the firstborn. It seems that Ezekiel is trying to explain this phenomenon. And Ezekiel was one of the first prophets to really have access to the Hebrew Bible and do anything with it. And so there's a number of times where he gives like reasonings for things that don't actually show up in the Torah. It's clear that Ezekiel's wrestling with some of the passages. Like he wants to figure out at one point, why is it that Israel was in Egypt for so long? He doesn't outright say it, but you can see in his reasoning, he's actually explaining, oh, because of your whorings in Egypt. That's when we get that famous passage about the, the emissions like stallions and large members and whatnot. Because he's explaining, when you were in Egypt, you were whoring around with other gods. That was the problem. But there's another passage in Ezekiel 20, and we're going to go to that real quick, where it looks like he's reminiscing back on Exodus 22. And it says, because I'm going to read verse 24 through 26. Because they had not executed my ordinances, but had rejected my statutes and profaned my Sabbaths, and their eyes were set on their ancestors' idols. Moreover, I gave them statutes that were not good, and ordinances by which they could not live. I defiled them through their very gifts in their offering up of their firstborn, in order that I might horrify them, so that they might know that I am Yahweh. And the offering up the firstborn in the Hebrew text gives the same description of passing over the fire that we would find in Jeremiah for when they passed the children over the fires in the valley of Hinnom. And so it seems that Ezekiel is saying, hey, God demanded child sacrifice at one point, but here's why he did it. Like, he's trying to explain away why God would command child sacrifice. But you might ask yourself, well, where in the world did God command child sacrifice? I don't remember that. The only option you have is go to the book of Exodus, which Ezekiel's pretty familiar with. And in Exodus, you'll find in chapter 22 and in chapter 13, you'll find a command to offer up the children. Now, Exodus 22 seems to be the one most likely that he had access to, because this is the one that talks about not redeeming humans. It says, you shall not delay in making offerings from the fullness of your harvest and from the outflow of your presses. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen, with your sheep. 7 days it shall remain with its mother, and on the 8th day you shall give it to me. And so this is probably the passage that Ezekiel had access to. We are aware typically of the other passage in chapter 13, where it talks about offering up the firstborn, but in that same chapter, there's extra language about redeeming them with other value rather than actually executing them. So, like most scholars, if Exodus was written in layers and Ezekiel only had one layer of the text at the time he was writing, you could definitely see where Ezekiel would look at chapter 22 and say, yeah, this is child sacrifice, but here's why. And then later, as the documentation becomes adjusted, added to, and redacted, you'll find additions like the doublet in chapter 13 that says to offer up your firstborn, but then it also says to redeem them.
But we also have that story of Jephthah and his daughter in Judges when he promises God, I'll offer the first thing that shows up to my door, and if I win against these foreigners, if I win this battle. And he
Yeah.
wins the battle, and Jephthah's daughter shows up, and he lets her run around for 2 months, if I remember correctly, and then he sets her aflame.
It's a pretty gruesome story.
Yeah.
Have you heard the apologetic for this?
I think I have. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it has something to do with, it's just her lamenting that she'll never get married and she'll have to be a virgin forever. Is that how it goes? That nonsense?
That's the apologetic, but it fails for 2 reasons. Before we read the text, I'll explain why the apologetic fails, because you actually don't need to read the whole text to know that it fails. But in the ancient times, what they're saying is, no, actually, she was dedicated to the temple. She wasn't actually offered up as a burnt offering. She was offered up as like a worker or a servant at the temple. But that doesn't actually work for a couple of reasons. One, they didn't have a temple yet. They had the tabernacle. How many attendants could work at the tabernacle? We're not really sure. But also, we know from history that they didn't, typically women who were attendants there, they didn't work there past puberty typically, because their flow of blood would make them unclean. In fact, we find this in the proto-evangelism of James. This is where we get the story of Mary getting married to Joseph at age 12 and giving birth at age 13. Because remember, in her narrative, she was dedicated to the temple. But the whole hubbub is like, hey, the people working at the temple are like, hey, she's about to hit puberty. It's coming soon. We have to get her out of here before she makes this place unclean. And so that's why they have to marry her off. So it wouldn't make sense that she would be a virgin the rest of her life just because she was dedicated to serving at the temple. She would have been married off eventually to somebody.
And the other issue they got is they can't explain how the text tells you that Jephthah did the deed at the end, but what
Ex-
deed did he do? And he never shows up again. The daughter never shows up again.
Yeah,
Just like gone.
that's
What
it.
could
That's
that
exactly
possibly
it.
be?
So that's the funny thing. If you, this is where reading the text is really important. And I don't know why this is so difficult. There's so many people that will only read part of the text and not the entire text. But if you go down to the end of the passage, it says at the end of the 2 months, she returned to her father, who did with her according to the vow that he made. Okay. Well, if he did the thing that he vowed to do, that means he had to make her a burnt offering because that's what he vowed to do. If he didn't make her a burnt offering, it would have said so. It would have said he dedicated her to the temple. It could have said all kinds of things, but it said specifically that he did according to his vow. And since we know what his vow is, obviously that's what he did. And the only question left is whether or not God found this to be acceptable. And I can't see a reason to think not. In Judges 11, when he makes the vow, there's two things that happen. One, the Spirit of God came upon Jephthah. Now, Jephthah can't command the Spirit of Yahweh. Like he can't make it fill him. Obviously, God sent the Spirit to him, same way he did with Samson, same way he did with others, like King Saul, when he receives the Spirit. So God sent the Spirit to Jephthah. When the Spirit reaches Jephthah, Jephthah, for one reason or another, maybe because he's under the power of the Spirit now, makes a rash vow. And the vow is basically let me win the war and I'll offer up the first thing that comes out of my door. Well, God saw fit to make sure he won the war, which means not only did God send his spirit, not only did the spirit not prevent him from doing something stupid, which it could have, but also God intervened. Like he got in the mix and made sure that he won the war. If God didn't want him to offer up his daughter, he could have just stayed in the mix and made sure an animal came out of that house first.
And he could have in another way he could have done it is like, oh, I don't really need you to sacrifice. Or as you just said, he could substitute the daughter for an animal, like he did with Isaac in Genesis.
Exactly. There's no reason. We already had the precedent in Genesis. There's no
Yeah.
reason why God couldn't, or even send the angel of the Lord. Remember, the angel of the Lord, theoretically in Genesis 22, comes in and prevents him from doing it. It wouldn't take anything off of God's back. It's not like his schedule's too busy. He's all powerful, basically, to send the angel of the Lord and say, hey, go down there and make sure he doesn't do this. I mean, it's great that he's willing to follow through with his vow. What a great guy for even doing a horrible thing to follow through with his vow. But we ain't got to do all this nonsense.
And there's that passage, I think it's in Numbers or Leviticus, one of them, the passage about keep the virgins to yourselves.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know what? That shows up twice. There's a parallel passage to that, that shows up in Judges 21. We'll touch on
Oh,
both of them. So in Numbers 31, we're gonna find also two things, and this is very Epstein-esque. We're gonna find that one, God is okay with the Israelites taking little virgin girls for war brides. And then we're also going to find that God, I think, as far as we can tell, thinks that the ones that some of them that go to the temple are going to get sacrificed along with the animals. So in Numbers 31, famously, Moses is the one that's upset when they come back from war, and some of them have been allowed to live. And typically the apologetic is, well, Moses commanded this, not God. Well, if we keep reading, God actually joins in and commands the same thing. But says Moses, Eleazar the priest, and the leaders of the congregation went to meet them outside of the camp. And Moses became angry with the officers of the army, the commanders of the thousands and commanders of hundreds, who had come from service in the war. Moses said to them, have you allowed all of the women to live? These women here, on Balaam's advice, made the Israelites act treacherously against the Lord in the affair of Peor, so that the plague came upon the congregation of the Lord. Now, therefore, kill every male among the little ones, so the children. It refers to them in Hebrew as hataf, the children. It's a collective noun. And kill every woman who has known a man by sleeping with him, but keep all the young girls, and these are young prepubescent girls, it would seem in the case, who have not known a man by sleeping with him, keep alive for yourselves. Okay, so we might ask ourselves, like, what does it mean to keep them alive for yourselves? Like, it could mean that maybe they're, I don't know, they're slaves. It could mean that they're servants. It could even mean that they are like going to go to the temple and act as servants in the temple. That doesn't seem to be clear actually from the case. But what we do know for sure is that they're children girls. We get the same word hataf in Hebrew, meaning children girls. That's why in my translation it just says young girls. But I think even in the King James it'll say child girls or something along that line. So nevertheless, what happened with these girls? Well, all you got to do is go over to Judges 21 and we find almost the exact same practice. So, what would they do with a bunch of little virgin girls? Well, they would make them war brides because that was their habit. So, if we go to Judges 21, we've got the famous story in 19, you already know, where the Levite's concubine is raped all night long, and then she shows up dead on the threshold of the house. And the Levite walks out, is enraged, ends up slicing and dicing her body up, sending it out to the other tribes to make war against the tribe of Benjamin because the Gibeonites were from Benjamin and that's who he was mad at. And so they make war and they all make a pact not to give any of their daughters in marriage to Benjamin since they did this horrible thing. And then they kind of eventually come around. They're like, oh no, one of our tribes, one of the Israelite tribes is going to die out because they've got no one to marry. And so, like, what are we going to do? We can't go back on our word. Remember, in the ancient world, if you take an oath, that oath is unbreakable. It was understood that if you broke your oath, God would personally hold you accountable. That's why all marriage contracts, all legal dealings always were signed off by the witness of human beings and gods. Gods held you accountable. That's what it means to take the name of the Lord, like in the Ten Commandments, to bear the name of the Lord. It's oath swearing. It's not misusing the name. So, anyways, the long and short of it is what they do is they say, here's what we'll do. Let's find a tribe that didn't go to war so we can have pretext against them. So they're like, there's this one tribe who decided not to come out to fight with us. So we've got pretext to fight against Jabesh Gilead. What are we going to do? Here's what we're going to do. We're going to take these women from Jabesh Gilead and we're going to take them for Benjamin. So in Judges 21, says the Israelites had compassion for Benjamin, their kin, and said, one tribe is cut off from Israel today. What shall we do for wives for those who are left, since we have sworn by the Lord that we will not give them any of our daughters as wives? So then they go to war with Jabesh Gilead, and it says they found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had never slept with a man and brought them to the camp at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan. The reason why you select young virgin girls as your war brides is because they're theoretically untainted. They're uncontaminated, which was a huge concern for these people in ancient times. That's why Deuteronomy 24 is really the only prohibition against divorce and remarry that we get in the Torah. Isn't actually concerned with divorce. Divorce was common in the ancient world. What they were concerned with was somebody getting divorced, going to another man, and then coming back to their original marriage bed and defiling that original marriage bed after they had been with another man. That's why you can't remarry your previous husband in Deuteronomy 24. So we know what they were doing with these little virgin girls in Numbers 31 because they already told us in Judges 21. They're capturing them so that they can become war brides, which is why they're distributed to the troops. If you look at, there's like 32,000 of them if you keep reading the chapter. And it says that they go to the troops. As the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, you and Eleazar the priest and the heads of your ancestral houses of the congregation make an inventory of the plunder captured, both human and animal. Divide the plunder into two parts between the warriors who went out to battle and the congregation, which means like young 20-year-old, 21, 22-year-old warriors are going to be given little virgin girls. This is not an adoption. They're not keeping them in their house safely. these are war brides. That's what's going to happen. And God, in verse 25, is the one commanding this: divide these little virgin girls among the warriors and the rest of the congregation. And then you keep reading and you find what appears to be either animal and human sacrifice, or perhaps service to the temple. Says, divide the plunder into two parts between the warriors who went out to battle and all the congregation. From the share of the warriors who went out to battle, set aside as tribute for the Lord, one item out of every 500, whether persons, oxen, donkey, or sheep. Take it from their half and give it to Eleazar the priest as an offering to the Lord. So the humans and animals seem to be given as an offering together, a tribute to the Lord, it says, a payment to God. So I don't know how you can see this as anything other than animal and human sacrifice put together, which we would expect because we have laws about this. And this last thing I'll say before we can jump in on something else. In Leviticus 28:29, and we'll probably touch on warfare practices eventually, we get a really interesting command about people that are under the harem warfare ban. Says, nothing that a person owns that has been devoted to destruction for the Lord, be it human or animal or inherited landholding, may be sold or redeemed. Every devoted thing is most holy to the Lord. No human beings who have been devoted to destruction can be ransomed. They shall be put to death. And devoted to destruction in the NRSV UE is the root word harem in Hebrew. And it means it's a dedicated killing for your God, which is what's happened in Numbers 31. The intention was to wipe out everybody there. It was a harem killing. That's why they were mad. Moses was mad because God told them to wipe everybody out. That's a harem, which means the little virgin girls that got married, that was a concession. The ones that got sent with the animals to the temple, they got murdered. They're done. It's a harem killing. They got sacrificed for the Lord.
There's also a passage about two women, I think they were prostitutes. They go up to the King Solomon, and Solomon's like, okay, I think it's a dispute over a baby. And it's like, yeah, we'll divide it in half. He proposed cutting it in half.
So this is supposed to be a passage that is about the wisdom of King Solomon. The Bible really wants you to think that Solomon was like the wisest person to ever live. I don't think he was.
Yeah,
but if
far
you go
from
to
it.
the chapter, I think it's 1 Kings 3, when you get the it's like his first act of great wisdom. And I don't think it's good. So basically, as you said, there are two women that have children. One of them dies. In fact, I'll pull it up and we'll grab it real quick. All right, so we're going to start in verse 16. Two women who were prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, "Please, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth while she was in the house. Then on the third day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth. We were together. There was no one else with us in the house. Only two of us were in the house. Then this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. She got up in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while your servant slept. She laid him at her breast and laid her dead son at my breast. When I rose in the morning to nurse my son, I saw that he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, clearly it was not the son I had born." So it was a switcheroo, right? And Solomon's solution is pretty wild. He says, this to the one that says, "This is my son who is alive and your son is dead," while the other says, "Not so, your son is dead and my son is a living one. Bring me a sword." And they brought a sword before the king. The king said, "Divide the living boy in two, then give half to," oh, my monitor just went blank for some reason. There we go. We're back. Give half to the one and half to the other. But the woman's son who was alive said to the king, because compassion for her son burned within her, "Please, my lord, give her the living boy." Certainly did not kill him. So this is one of the interesting passages where it's like, what a weird, it's not a dumb solution. It seems like he's not intending the child to be cut in half, but what a weird thing to even allow someone to think that you would cut a baby in half.
Yeah, that's disgusting. And it's like it's one after the other. We're not done. We got more to go through tonight, and it's so many. And I want people that try to defend this stuff that as oh, it's not sounding what it sounds like. Well, how many times does it have to sound horrible? How many instances of it does it take before we start saying no? That's exactly what it looks like.
And there are many instances where, people make a big deal like God hates child sacrifice. Well, he might say that, but he didn't say I hate child sacrifice to me. He hates it to other deities. Like in Jeremiah,
Right.
he says about the children being offered in the valley of Hinnom. I didn't ask for that. It didn't even cross my mind. But when it comes to children killed in his name, oh, he loves it. He's all about it. In fact, he seems to revel at the idea. In fact, he brags about it on a couple different occasions. I think there are 2, and if you don't mind me, rabbit trailing on you, there are 2
Sure.
instances that I think are really telling about how God really just he has no care for children. We're gonna go to Isaiah 13:16, and then we'll also do Hosea, and we'll do actually 13:16 again. So it's interesting when it comes to the Babylonians, God's like, "Listen, we're gonna smush them. In fact, I'm stirring up the Medes against them." And it says, "Their infants will be dashed to pieces before their eyes, their houses will be plundered, and their wives raped." And then he says, like, same thing, he's gonna do to Samaria previously when he brings in the Assyrian army to crush the Sumerians. He says, "Samaria shall bear her guilt because she has rebelled against her God. They shall fall by the sword. Their little ones shall be dashed to pieces, and their pregnant women ripped open." So God is like, "Listen, my form of punishment when y'all act up is to make sure your babies' heads are smashed open and your pregnant women are ripped open." And I understand from a Christian standpoint, you're like, "Well, this is God's judgment." Well, that might be the case, but if God was all powerful, he could to like any method of judgment he wants. Like there's no limit to like he could literally snap his fingers and just put grievous sores on all the people who participated in the thing that he was mad about and then spare the babies, right? Or he could just click his fingers and make all the people just disappear. Or he could have made it so that the wicked people, their wombs were closed up so they couldn't have children anymore. So when he killed them, he didn't have to kill the children with them. There are so many solutions other than I'm going to make sure your babies' heads are smashed open on rocks and your pregnant women are literally going to be ripped open.
Yeah, I remember that passage. That's just really disgusting. I don't see how anybody could read that, especially of how descriptive it is.
It's a
It's
tough
horrible.
one. Like if you believe in a God that is all powerful, none of these punishments are ever necessary. But like, if God was just like I don't know, a really powerful, superhuman, you could see where like, I don't know, maybe I'll pull some strings and create war. But he's not. He's all powerful. He can do whatever he wants. He doesn't have to like manipulate an army into coming to do his work. In fact, remember with the Assyrians, he sends the angel of the Lord, and the angel of the Lord killed like 182,000 of the army. And then also in 2 Samuel 24, when David takes the census, the angel of the Lord comes and kills 70,000 Israelites. So if God wanted to punish people, he doesn't have to bring in an army that's going to come rape the women and murder the babies. He could send the angel of the Lord, just like he did in Exodus. He could send the angel of the Lord and only get the people that need to be got. Doesn't have to kill anybody innocent. Remember in Exodus, you painted over your doorpost, and the angel of the Lord only got the babies or the children of the Egyptians. That's a little more of a Mm. We'll say it's a less horrific way to murder people because at least, you know, some decent people got spared. Although we would definitely say that the kill because it says in Exodus that even the handmaiden, the Egyptian slaves, their sons will die too. So it's weird that even like slaves, whether it's local slave or foreign slave working in Israel, their firstborn would be murdered as well by the angel of the Lord. God just doesn't he's not overly concerned with, with the babies or even the children dying. In fact, He brags about it in Jeremiah and Leviticus, in Leviticus 26, and I forget which chapter in Jeremiah, I can look it up. He literally brags about the punishment that he's gonna bring on the people. It says, "I will bereave them of their children." In fact, he talks about bringing in wild animals. In verse 21 and 22, it says, "I will let loose wild animals against you, and they shall bereave you of your children and destroy your livestock." What kind what kind of a God thinks that wild animals eating children is a viable punishment for not properly worshiping him?
Yeah, that's ridiculous, and I can't help but wonder if some of these ideas had, influenced the way Jesus is portrayed in the New Testament with the Eucharist. My body is flesh, my blood is wine." And Jesus is presented as the firstborn sacrifice of God.
Yeah, it's a wild thing because people will say, as we've already noted, God, hates child sacrifice. Well, that can't be the case. Like, first of all, he murders children all the time, and he brags about murdering children. In fact, he you could even say, well, God doesn't like cannibalism. I guess we'll get a 2 for 1 here, because Christians think that cannibalism's wrong, and then they also think that human sacrifice is wrong. Well, Jesus is a 2 for 1, and God has his own son murdered brutally, and then makes you eat them. And you're like, "Well, it's not a real cannibalism." God would never, charge you with real cannibalism, but actually he would. In fact, in Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, and Jeremiah 19, he tells you he will punish you with cannibalism. For example, in Jeremiah 19:9, says, "I will make them." That's in the causative stem. "I will cause them to do this. I will make them eat the flesh of their sons and the flesh of their daughters, and all shall eat the flesh of their neighbors in the siege and in the distress with which their enemies and those who seek their life will afflict them." And if you read the same chapter, he brags about him doing this. "I'm bringing the army to punish you so poorly, that so badly that you're gonna have to eat your own children."
It kinda reminds me of some of those, brutal passages in the Talmud, and I think Josephus talked about it too, about some woman eating cannibalizing her infant during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE.
Yeah, that shows up in, Lamentations. So, there's a couple instances in the Bible where people are depicted eating, their young. One is in the siege of the Assyrians in Samaria. There's a story of 2 women where this is not something that I think God necessarily caused, it's just an interesting story. There are 2 women that are starved out, and they make an agreement, "I'll eat my son, we'll cook my son today, and tomorrow we'll cook your son." And then so they have an agreement, the lady kills and cooks her son, and then the next day, the other lady reneges. She's like, "I ain't killing my son." So they go to the king to settle this, dispute. So we know that this was something that could happen in ancient warfare, and it was recorded in Lamentations as the hands of compassionate women. This is Lamentations 4:10. "The hands of compassionate women have boiled their own children. They became their food in the destruction of my people." And so, unfortunately, in the ancient world, children being either sacrificed or killed seemed to be like a byproduct of the time period.
We have a super chat question. I'm gonna take that real quick before we continue. Jack Patterson, thank you for your super chat. The synoptics appear to say Jesus was born to Mary and Joseph of late Christology. When do we think the rewrite to parthenogenesis occurred?
Hmm.
I'm
That's
not
a
even
fair
sure how to answer that
question.
question. Yeah.
I don't know if we have data that would help us decide because it'd be too speculative. Unfortunately, the New Testament documents that we have, we don't have like a rich history to show when they were changed, where they were changed, and how they were changed. You are kinda left speculating a little bit on that one.
Yeah. And there's a isn't there another thing that we didn't cover? David's sin and Bathsheba.
Oh, yeah, one of my
Yeah,
favorite passages too.
let's bring that up.
So in 2 Samuel 12, there's like this really interesting story that I feel like a lot of people know, but they only know part of it. So we all know David called for Bathsheba when he lusted for her out of his window. And she was already married. And what are you going to do? Reject the king? No, the king tells you to come, you come. So she comes, they sleep together. She gets pregnant and he's alarmed. Oh no, we gotta deal with this. So he has the husband, Uriah, sent to the front lines. The army pulls back to make sure he dies in battle. So then he can take Bathsheba and kind of bury this whole situation. And eventually, obviously, Nathan comes to him. We all know the story, and he gives him a really great parable about a person who's got a lamb or an ewe that is treasured to him, and it gets taken. It's only his only one, and this is supposed to be in comparison to what King David did. And so, because King David performed this horrible deed of essentially adultery and murder, here's a punishment. And the punishment is interesting because like it feels like everybody gets punished except for David. So in verse 11, we find the first punishment. And the first punishment is what everybody forgets. People remember the second punishment, which we'll read next. The first punishment, almost always people don't realize it's here. Thus saith the Lord, I will raise up trouble against you from within your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor. And he shall lie with your wives in broad daylight. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel in broad daylight. And so the punishment is that, hey, listen, some of your wives, David, are going to be taken captive because there's going to be war. Somebody in your household is going to make war with you, and they're going to cause some of your wives to be taken by your neighbor. And obviously, Christians would be like, well, this is not, God didn't cause it. This is not actually, rape. This is something else. They consented. But if you just read the passage, it's pretty clear that actually none of that's true. It's actually quite preposterous. So in chapter 16, the continuation of the story, Absalom has already chased David out of the palace. He's already taken over. He's king now. He's in the palace, and he wants to solidify his authority. And so he fulfills the prophecy from chapter 12. It says Absalom said to Ahithophel, that's one of the advisors, give us your counsel. What shall we do? And Ahithophel said to Absalom, go into your father's concubines, the ones that he left to look after the house, and all Israel will hear that you have made yourself odious to your father, and the hands of all who are with you will be strengthened. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. This was a typical power move. When you thought you were the king, you would take over and you would sleep with your father's concubines as a show of force, or your father's wives even, as a show of force that these are mine now. These belong to me. I'm king, which is exactly what we find at the beginning of God's reprimand. It says, Nathan said to David, you are that man. Thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel. I anointed you king over Israel, and I rescued you from the hands of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom. So when the power dynamic changes, those concubines get sent to the new king as well. And so Absalom slept with the 10 concubines / wives of David as a show of force. And then later, when David retook the throne, remember in chapter 20, he retakes the throne, and they send the women away because they've been defiled. They don't get punished because they didn't do anything wrong. They didn't commit adultery, according to Deuteronomy 22. They didn't have committed a crime. So David sends them away, and they live out their days in peace, but not having been touched again by David now that they've been defiled by Absalom. So God's punishment for these poor women is to have them raped brutally as a display of force. There's no good reason to think that this was consensual, which is, I know a lot of Christians are shouting at me right now. Well, the women wanted it. That's preposterous to think. Not only was this against multiple laws, but there's no reason why a woman in this time period would knowingly and willingly have consensual sex with their sons. Remember, these are all stepmothers of Absalom, with their son, which was forbidden. You would have been dead. And then also in broad daylight in front of everybody. No woman in the ancient world is going to volunteer to have sex in broad daylight with somebody that would have made sure that they were murdered if it was an actual consensual situation. So that's just how this God operates. He thinks raping women can be used as a punishment because women are more or less property. They're not really people, which we'll definitely want to touch on next. And the other punishment is the baby dies. In the same chapter, it says that God made the baby sick for a period of 7 days. And then after 7 days of suffering, that baby died. So for David's crime, the child died in his place, a human sacrifice for David's place. And then 10 of David's wives were raped.
It's just absolutely horrific. Jennifer Solves, thank you for your super chat. The Raptors' 22nd March, we eat rotisserie chicken, play green jello, and usher in Shakur law. Bird hips don't lie.
That was great, Jennifer. Actually, I haven't heard Green Jello in a long time. Are you doing the Three Little Pigs song? I'd be curious to know which one of their jams you're going to be listening to. That's an old reference, by the way. You have to be old as me to get that one.
Back in 8 months, member, thank you. First layer written after exile or around Jeremiah?
It's a good question. So there's a lot of connection with the Deuteronomist and Jeremiah. I think the Deuteronomist was late, probably post-exile. So when you see passages that seem to really coincide with Jeremiah and they're part of the Deuteronomist, I would definitely classify these as far post-exile. But we do know there seems to be quite a bit of the Torah that could or maybe even should be classified as pre-exilic. My good buddy Chet has done a little bit of work on this, documenting some of the pre-exilic Hebrew from looking at the actual forms. You can find some pretty archaic Hebrew forms that just didn't exist, or rather, it was only popularized prior to the exile. And then you can say, oh, well, this section of text probably came from the pre-exilic period, the same way we would do with like the Song of Deborah or the Song of the Sea. We would look at the age of the Hebrew and say, this looks like pre-exilic Hebrew, but it's certainly hard to say how much of it is pre-exilic because, the form of Hebrew that almost all of our texts are in is in the Aramaic block script, which came from the Arameans. It's from the biblical Exodus exile period. So prior to the Babylonian exile, they would have been writing in Paleo Hebrew. It's unfortunately that most of our texts are not actually in Paleo Hebrew, but possible maybe the Samaritan Pentateuch has preserved some of it. The Samaritan Pentateuch famously is still written in Paleo Hebrew, but it's only the Torah. There's nothing else in there other than the first 5 books.
There's also another passage, I can't remember off the top of my head where it is, but it's when those woman that went up to a person's door and she was, she wouldn't get up. She just wouldn't move, so he takes her and this is after she was, raped repeatedly by a group of men,
Judges
and
19, yeah.
and he's he decides, okay, so he cuts her up into multiple pieces and just mails her body all over Israel for some reason.
So we touched on this a little bit earlier. Basically, the thing that happened after she was raped, it's actually a parallel to Genesis 19 with the Sodom and Gomorrah episode. But the Gibeonites have so enraged the Levite that he wants to make war against them. So he cuts up the body and sends it out to the other tribes of Israel to muster enough troops to wage war against the Benjaminites to punish them for this horrific crime that they've committed, which is where we get the ending of that whole section in chapter 21, where they decide, well, in order to get wives for Benjamin now, because we've sworn that Benjamin can't have our wives anymore, in order to get wives for Benjamin, we're going to have to do some stuff that is, well, unsavory. So they go to war against Jabesh Gilead, and they kidnap their women, the little virgin girls. They kidnap them and turn them into wives. But as it turned out, if you keep reading, that's not enough. They need more wives. And so Later, they make another deal, and it's just as bad. Like, it's just as bad almost. It says, so they said, "Look, the yearly festival of the Lord is taking place at Shiloh, which is north of Bethel on the east of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem, south of Lebanon." And they instructed the Benjamites, saying, "Go and lie in wait in the vineyards and watch. When young women of Shiloh come out to dance in the dances, then come out of the vineyards, and each of you carry off a wife for himself from the young women of Shiloh and go to the land of Benjamin. Then, if their fathers or their brothers come to complain to us, we will say to them, 'Be generous and allow us to have them, because we did not capture in battle a wife for each man. But neither did you incur guilt by giving your daughters to them.'" So, like, well, we're not going to give them our daughters. We're not going to allow them to enter into the traditional marriage festivities, but we will let them go and just kidnap these poor young women dancing at the festival. It's horrific.
I think so far we've covered mostly the most well-known parts, but there are other parts, I know they're there, but I can't remember off the top of my head, but I know you've got them. Um, so what other parts would you like to start off with?
I think it's important to recognize that there's a thing happening in the biblical text, and I feel like it doesn't get brought up enough. And it might not be people's fault. I think maybe the problem is that people aren't aware of the ancient Near Eastern customs all that well. But the practice of concubine itself was like, it was kind of horrific. It's not to say that every woman who was ever a concubine was not having a good time. There were some women that knowingly and willingly entered into concubinage. They looked at their lot in life and said, "You know what? I'd be better off as a concubine. Let me find somebody who's well off, who needs a concubine, and make a contract with them." That was certainly something that happened. But most concubines were not through that method. Most of them were purchased as slaves. They were made concubines against their own will, or they were purchased from somebody who needed to get rid of a girl. So you could theoretically have a daughter and be like, "I can't care for this daughter. I don't have money." And you can sell her off as a concubine. And the age at which you do that is almost any age you want. There was like kind of an unwritten rule at a certain time period that if you sold a young girl as a concubine, you should wait until they reach puberty plus 1 year, but that didn't really show up until the rabbinic period. The reason was you want them to be fully matured, reach physical puberty plus 1 year for their brain to develop. That was the general idea. But it also says if you're really poor, you could theoretically sell your daughter prior to becoming age 13 if you really needed the money. And we find something akin to this in Exodus 21. Says, "When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do." So keep in mind, this woman is a slave. And it says, "If she does not please her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed." So the next question we would ask is like, "Hey, what are we talking about? Let her be redeemed." That's a slave term, but what's this designation business? Because like designated doesn't carry a ton of weight in the English language. But if you actually go to the Hebrew text, it seems that this is talking about betrothal, meaning this is a woman who has been chosen and or betrothed. And so what we find here is that you can buy a slave girl and make her a slave wife. Now, a slave wife is a very traditional way of getting a concubine. And the goal of doing this is to reproduce. You need to, and we'll touch on this later. We find this over and over again in the biblical text, getting concubines with the express purpose of reproducing. And if you buy a slave girl as a concubine in the ancient world, and she didn't produce you sons or daughters, typically sons, within a certain number of years, you can get rid of them too. The same with wives. If you marry a wife, we'll go over some contracts here in a bit. If you marry a woman in the ancient world and she doesn't give you children, there's a waiting period before you can get a concubine. So it might be 3 years, sometimes it's 7 years. But if you marry a woman who will not give you children, you absolutely were allowed to buy a slave girl or take a slave girl against her will and have children with her, because slaves didn't have rights. Which is why we find in Leviticus, if you sleep with another man's slave, if you take her virginity, that woman doesn't get to go free. She doesn't get compensated. You pay the man who owns that slave girl. When you've slept with that slave girl, you make recompense to the slave owner, because you've taken something that belongs to him. You've taken that woman's virginity that belonged to him. That was something that was valuable to him. But anyways, in Exodus 21, it says you can buy a little slave girl and you can designate her for yourself as a concubine. The only thing that's positive in here is if you designate it for your son, like you bought this slave girl, the slave girl is going to become your son's wife. She's allowed to become a primary wife rather than just a concubine. So that's one positive note. But again, remember, these women didn't have consent. They weren't agreeing to this. Their parents were selling them as slaves. They didn't get the consent to being sold as slaves. And then another man who had money was like, you're either going to sleep with me or you're going to be my daughter and you're going to sleep with my son. This is what's happening. And so it's just not a good look that the Bible seems to be okay with the practice of concubinage. And if you're wondering, like, how bad was concubinage in the ancient world? Sometimes it was really bad. Concubines, because they were typically still considered some classification of slaves, they could be beaten, for example, if their master needed them to reproduce because their primary wife couldn't reproduce and they weren't willing to reproduce, they could be severely beaten. Sometimes they would be beaten and then sold off to foreigners. And some people, I know there are Christians that are watching this and they're like, you know what, Justin's making stuff up. I'll just give you, I've got 3 definitions of concubinage from Christian dictionaries. I've got the Ehrman's Bible Dictionary, the Baker Encyclopedia of the Bible, and the Holman Illustrated Bible Dictionary. All 3 dictionaries are solidly in the evangelical Christian camp. And this is what it says. A concubine, according to Ehrman's Bible Dictionary, is a female slave responsible primarily for bearing children to ensure continuation of the family name, referencing Genesis 16 with Hagar, and also Genesis chapter 30, which we can get to. That's Jacob and Bilhah and Zilpah, those 2 concubines. Accordingly, she was regarded as a member of the family, agreed, and as a legitimate avenue for succession and inheritance. Although, as we saw with Hagar, remember, Sarah chased her away, said this slave girl will not have any of the inheritance. It says access to the royal concubines was viewed as a legal claim to the throne, which is what I said earlier. Sleeping with royal concubines was a power move. Hence, they were accorded special protection. That is true, which we want to talk on one thing before we leave the concubine discussion still yet. But they were given special protection as concubines. That's true. People who looked after them were typically eunuchs. Concubines were viewed with affection by their husbands, certainly were sometimes. And any assault on their well-being might be a cause for vengeance, as we saw in Judges 19, although frequently their function was to provide sexual gratifications, as described in Ecclesiastes 2:8. They might also be given considerable responsibility, and that's fine. So basically, it's a sex slave. Concubinage in the Baker Encyclopedia of the Bible says much the same practice of a man cohabitating with a woman who is regarded only as his sexual partner or as a secondary wife in the household of lower station than his primary wife. Concubinage was practiced in many ancient cultures, especially Mesopotamia, where the king maintained a harem, where a private citizen might have 1 or 2 concubines in addition to his primary wife. Both types of concubinage are referred to in the Bible. A concubine was often a slave or part of war booty. A man might have a concubine simply as an economical form of marriage, since no dowry or bride price was required. And this is likely the case behind the Levite. The Levites typically weren't well endowed with wealth because they didn't even have land or inheritance. So they would typically, you can find a concubine who would become a sexual partner for them rather than trying to afford having a traditional family and a wife. And then last from Holman, it says it's concubine is a wife of lower status, usually a slave, and then sometimes a primary wife taking of concubines dates back to at least the patriarchal period. Both Abraham and Nahor had concubines. Tribal chiefs, kings, and other wealthy men typically took concubines. Gideon had a concubine. He actually had a number of concubines. Saul had at least one concubine named Rizpah. That is true. She shows up again in after his death in 2 Samuel 21. David had many concubines. Solomon took the practice to extreme, having 300 concubines in addition to 700 royal wives. And so this practice of concubinage in the ancient world shows up in the Bible because, the God of the Bible simply just didn't care all that much about these women. They weren't a problem for him. You know what I mean? Slave sex wives were just commonplace, and the God of the Bible was like, yeah, sure, you can do it.
Joe Festitius, thank you for your super chat. What are your thoughts on the Samaritans?
Mm. So the Samaritans are really interesting. It seems like in the post-exilic period, there was a huge fight. Even in the period of the Greeks, there was this huge fight for the Samaritans versus the Judeans, who were the rightful heirs to the religion and the heritage. And obviously the Judeans won out, and because we have the Bible and it's heavily, redacted by Judean scribes. As you know, most people who studied the Hebrew Bible knows that it's basically Judean propaganda. That being said, the Samaritans appear to be ancient Canaanites. I am on board with like William Devers and Israel Finkelstein and other people who did the archaeology of ancient Israel. It seems like they came from the Canaanite people, and most of their language, most of their practices mirror what we find in the Canaanite language and culture. Even the god El comes from the Canaanite culture. Finding the Ugaritic tablets has absolutely made this abundantly clear that the northern Israelites appear to have just been Canaanites. We don't know so much about the Judeans. Maybe the Judeans actually did have a break off from some Semitic peoples that came in and out of Egypt and maybe dwelt in the land of Midian for a while. But as far as I can tell, the Samaritans were originally Canaanites, and then they got mixed with the Assyrians. Remember when the Assyrians wiped out the northern 10 tribes, a lot of the Israelites got shipped out, and foreigners from the land of Assyria got shipped in, and then they intermixed with what was left of those Israelites, which is why the Jews didn't like them, because they were no longer like purebloods anymore. They were mixed.
Back and thank you for your super chat. What about the scripture text written in Chaldean?
I'm not sure of scripture, like biblical texts that are written in the Akkadian language. If they exist, I've not heard of them.
Yeah,
I
I
took
got
some
no idea what he's
Akkadian.
talking about.
Yeah, I took some Akkadian when I was in school. I feel like this might have come up. I feel like my professor would have been pretty keen on bringing this up, but I don't remember hearing anything about this one.
Back and thank you for never super chat. The Benjamin story sounds like the Bacchae Maenads.
Mm. It's interesting. There's been a lot of people that have done comparisons with some of the Greek mythologies, like the Bacchus and the biblical stuff. Unfortunately, the Greek mythology is not something I've spent enough time on. I feel like you and Derek have spent a lot more time dealing with the Greek mythology.
So what other horrific stories have we not covered yet in these texts?
You know what? There's one that kind of goes under the radar, and I think that is the story of Esther. So Esther's an interesting story because if you were in the church for any amount of time, you kind of get this idea of like, oh man, God, look how cool God was. He saved his people by using Esther. What he took this lowly girl and like elevated her to queen in order to save the people. But like, here's the thing. The way he did it was not necessary, and it seems to be like super, super sus. So basically, he had a little teenage girl who he's like, okay, in order to save my people, I could just show up and click my fingers, or I could just send the angel of the Lord to kill all of them. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna have this little teenage girl get all pretty and gussied up for a time period, and then have her become a concubine, and then have her seduce the king. And that's basically what happened. So, if in fact you can tell that she has become a concubine because she's being kept in the harem and being watched by the king's eunuchs. In fact, it says in chapter 2, verse 3, the king appointed commissioners in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young girls into the harem in the citadel of Susa under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch. Well, the king's eunuch was a eunuch because he was overseeing the harem full of wives and concubines. And so she enters in uh, the the harem as a concubine, and then she's basically out here shagging the king until he's like, "Oh, I really like this one. I'm going to make her a wife." Right? So it says when the turn came for Esther, daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had adopted her as his own daughter, to go into the king. She asked for nothing except that Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was admired by all who saw her. When Esther was taken to the king Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than any of the other women. Of all the virgins, she won his favor and devotion. So basically, God's like, I'm going to have this little girl become a sexual object to the king, and that's the method I'm going to use to save my people. A very suspect method.
There's one that occurs to me that we didn't cover yet in 2 Kings 2:23 to 24, the story of the children getting ripped apart by bears because they insulted Elisha.
Yeah. Second Kings 2 is a funny one. You know, if I remember correctly, I think David Falk tried to do an apologetic video on this, and a couple people, and the general consensus is like they're trying to make it sound like they're not kids, and they're trying to make it sound like they were in a imminent danger for Elisha. Or they'll say, "Well, they didn't like it wasn't that bad. The bears didn't kill them." But I mean, it does say that they were ripped open in the intensive stem in Hebrew. But it says he went up from Bethel, and while he was going up on the way, some small boys. Na'ar is like a young man, and katan is the word for small. So we just have this in the plural, na'arim, katanim in Hebrew. So little youths came out of the city and jeered at him, which is what you would expect from kids. Remember when you were what, like 9, 10, 11? You make fun of a guy for being bald. That's kind of what you would do about that age. Saying, "Go away, bald head, go away, bald head." When he turned around and saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 she bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the boys. Well, I mean, listen, I don't know about you, but if 2 she bears are mauling you, the odds of survival aren't very good. And it seems like even if you're surviving the bear attack, it's not like you're gonna be in great shape after. I don't know when people say, "Well, it's okay because they didn't die." I don't know necessarily how that makes it better. Like, if listen, I get it. If I had to pick between my son being mauled by a bear or being killed by a bear, I'm gonna pick mauling, obviously. But that doesn't mean that the mauling is not horrific. The mauling by a bear is an absolutely horrific thing to happen. There's no good reason for, again, for an all-powerful God to have bears maul a bunch of youths. He could, you know what he could have done if he was really cool? He could have showed up and be like, "You know what? Because of this, I'm gonna make all the children bald, and I'm gonna give Elisha their hair." Like, there's so many other solutions other than, "Hey, let's have bears come out and kill some kids," that it's just it's a baffling story, and I get why apologists want it to go away. Like, I totally understand why they're like, "We need to find a way to soften this story," 'cause it's just it's a rough one. And how much does God really care about kids? That he's willing, rather than just show up and be like, "Hey, guys, we need to rectify this situation." Rather than doing that, he just sends bears. It's not a good look.
From what you've seen, and I know you've done some streams on this as well, what are some of the most ridiculous apologetics you've ever heard about any of these passages or passages like them that we haven't covered or have covered?
Mm. Well, I'll tell you what, when it comes to the passages about concubinage, what they'll typically say is, well, it's okay because they become wives. Like, so it's like, it's better than being a slave. They'll say, well, it's actually better than being a slave because you get some rights. But the rights don't seem to be that much different than a slave. Like your slave rights, you're going to get housed, you'll get some clothing, you'll get some food. If your master was nice, you might get gifts, you might get free time even. You do get the Sabbath. You get to take the Sabbath off as a slave. But it's not clear that a concubine got anything more than that. In fact, in Exodus 21, when it talks about taking on a concubine, like a second wife, it doesn't tell you that she has any more rights than a slave. It says, if he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish the food, clothing, or marital rights of the first wife. Okay, so the first wife gets food, clothing, and conjugal rights. That's not that great. And the other thing too is the only thing you could expect a concubine to get that maybe a slave wouldn't get is possibly the child of the concubine could, and it wasn't required, could get part of the inheritance when the landowner died. But that was a mercy play, and we find that even in the Bible, it didn't seem to happen. Like when Hagar and Ishmael are sent away in Genesis, what does Abraham give them? Is there inheritance? No, no inheritance. What about food, clothing, and other stuff? Not much. He gives them a skin of water and a loaf of bread and sends them into the desert to die. And this is God's best dude, Abraham. And that's all he does for them. In the ancient Mesopotamia law codes, like in the law code of Hammurabi, if a woman provides you a son, even if it's a concubine, that woman and her son get cared for when you send them away. In fact, you're required to give them a certain amount of money and a certain portion of your estate. Not in the Bible, though.
Do you feel like that the situation that's going on with apologists is they're trying to impose their modernized morality into the Bible? So it kind of impairs, it blinds them from seeing the text as it is.
A little bit. And I think what you want to do is, so what happens when you read a book or when you hear a story, you picture it in your head and you picture it with all the things that are familiar to you. That's why when you look at like classic depictions of Bible stories or Jesus, like if an Asian drew it, the people look Asian. If somebody from Scotland or Ireland drew it, it looks like somebody with red hair and they're Scottish looking. You tend to fill in the blanks with what is familiar to you. So when you're reading these ancient texts like the Bible, it's easy to read something in here and be like, well, how would this look today? Because if you don't know, right? That's why, when you people may not be aware of this, when you go to Bible college and seminary, you spend a lot of time studying the culture, either Mediterranean culture or Mesopotamian, ancient Near Eastern culture, so you can contextualize what's happening in the text. And without that contextualization, I think a lot of Christians are just kind of left to their own devices and they're filling in the gaps with the information that they currently have. But because we know so much about the ancient world, like just a cursory knowledge of the ancient Near East would dispel quite a bit of that stuff. And a good example of this, a lot of Bible translations, when it talks about harem killing, it will say either the ban, or it will say like utter annihilation, or it will say devoted to destruction. Devoted to destruction is not terrible, but it turns out though that we've got Sabaean texts, we got Moabite texts, and we've got some Ugaritic texts that mention this like harem offering, and they all seem to agree that these are people that are being murdered. They're being wiped out entirely for the Lord. In fact, one of the most popular editions comes on the Mesha stele. The Moabite king in the 9th century, King Mesha, the one who sacrificed his own son in 2 Kings chapter 3, which is another interesting. Maybe I'll end on that. 2 Kings 3 is my favorite child sacrifice passage, perhaps. But in the Mesha Stele, he talks actually about how, first of all, he defeated Yahweh and stole the vessels of Yahweh, which is amazing. But he also says that he was charged by Chemosh, his god, to go and take the city of Nebo from Israel and to dedicate it, right? So he says, so I went in the night and I fought there from dawn until noon, and I took it and I killed everyone, 7,000 men, boys, women, daughters, and pregnant women, because I devoted it to Ashtar Chemosh. I took from there the hearth and the altars of Yahweh, and I brought it before Chemosh. So he's saying in the original tongue, he calls this a harem killing, a harem offering. He killed all the men, women, and children as a harem killing for the Lord, for his Lord. And when we find this in other texts in the ancient Near East, it means the same thing. It means you're killing everybody. You're dedicating an entire city or an entire group of people as a killing or an offering from the Lord. It's a complete purification. The goal is to eliminate all the people and purify the land that they were located on. So that's why we know in the Bible, when we talk about these harem killings, we know what they're talking about. It's a killing for God. Although I forgot the thing that I was going to bring up next that I just mentioned. I apologize. I got carried away with harem.
Well, that's all right. I think you were talking about the sacrifice during the Moab situation, child sacrifice in
Oh
Kings.
yeah. This is a really thank you for the reminder. This is a really cool passage that doesn't get enough attention. And I think it tells us a couple things. One, that child sacrifice in the ancient world was not just God wasn't just mad that you were killing your child. God doesn't care about children. He kills children all the time. Like Numbers chapter 5, the potion, right? If a woman's caught cheating or they think that she's cheating, she drinks the potion and then her womb discharges and she miscarries. So, not a problem. If God wants a baby to die because the woman was unfaithful, he doesn't care. But what he doesn't want you to do is sacrifice your child to another god. And that's what happens in 2 Kings chapter 3. And I think the reason why he doesn't want you to do that becomes clear. It says, first of all, God tells Jehoshaphat and the other people at war that I'm going to hand them over to you. You're going to be victorious. I'm going to hand the enemy over to you. It's a done deal. So they go to war and it looks like they're going to succeed. But right at the time where they think they're going to succeed, something interesting happens. It says, when all the Moabites heard that the kings had come up to fight against them, all who were able to put on armor, from the youngest to the oldest, were called out and were drawn up at the frontier. When they rose early in the morning and the sun shone upon the water, the Moabites saw the water opposite of them as red blood. They said, "This is blood. The king must have fought together and killed one another." Sorry, the kings must have fought together and killed one another. Now then, Moab to the spoil. But when they came to the camp of Israel, the Israelites rose up and attacked the Moabites, who fled before them as they entered Moab, and they continued the attack. The cities were overturned, and every good piece of land, they threw stones on it till it was covered, until every spring of water was stopped up, and every good tree they felled. Only in Kir Hareseth did the stone walls remain until the slingers surrounded and attacked it. So it sounds like Moab's about to be defeated. It says, when the king of Moab saw that the battle was going against him, he took his 700 swordsmen to break through opposite of the king of Edom, but they could not. Then he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him, and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. And a great wrath came upon Israel. So they withdrew from him and returned to their own land. So God's promise failed. They didn't capture Moab. And it was the sacrifice of the son of the king that caused a great spiritual wrath of some nature to come upon Israel that prevented them from succeeding in the mission that their God was helping them with. So it seems like God's real problem with child sacrifice is that you might sacrifice a baby to another God and he might come and mess me up.
And one last thing before we close, can you tell people where they may be able to find good resources on on some of the passages in question, the scholarship therein, because there may be some people in the audience like, there's a that the good points were made from the stream tonight, and they're questioning the Bible, and they may want to know more about these horrific passages.
So I'm a big fan of academic resources. I think what you'll find in academic biblical studies, it's altogether different than what you're going to find in the church. Like if I brought some of my academic resources to a church Bible study, they would chase me out. But this is what scholars talk about. Scholars aren't having debates about apologetics. They're having debates about, hey, we have this Hebrew word that shows up in the Bible. We have like a word like harem. What are we supposed to do with this? How are we supposed to interpret it, right? Some good resources, and I'll grab a couple from my shelf real quick that I think anyone can have access to, and it's just really easy to even get electronically as well. That might be helpful. So if you don't have a ton of money to spend on like a whole library, when I was in school, I was running my own business, so I had to have all my books on hand. I couldn't spend a bunch of time at the library, so I spent thousands of dollars investing in electronic library, and I've never regretted it. It's the best money I've ever spent. But some of the print stuff in my library I've used ever since. One of my favorites is really helpful. The Dictionary of the Old Testament. This is the InterVarsity print. This is a 3-volume set. This is just one of them. I've got all 3 of them. This is on the historical books, but there's one for the Torah and there's one for the prophets. This is a very well done academic dictionary. It's going to give you lots of resources. For example, if you look up like the Day of Atonement in this dictionary, it will give you resources from the ancient Near East to put it in context. Like, here's why they were doing what they were doing. Here's what we see in the Assyrian texts and in the Hittite texts. This is how to make sense of these things. And they've got really cool articles in here too. Like you can read about the Nephilim, the sons of God. You can find all kinds of really cool stuff. Another volume that I love, and they do have this for the New Testament as well, is the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Background Commentary. I'm not crazy about Zondervan stuff, but maybe about 10 or 15 years ago, they started doing academic publications. And their academic publications since then have actually been really good. And I'll just give you a smattering of some of the Old Testament scholars that participated in this particular set. So Genesis, the contributor was John Walton. John Walton, whether you're a liberal or conservative, really well revered. Bruce Wells from Johns Hopkins, Roy Gain from UC Berkeley, Dennis Cole from New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. Deuteronomy was done by Eugene Carpenter. Eugene Carpenter, peace be upon him, was an amazing, prolific evangelical writer, but does really good with his academic sources. And it got Richard Hess, of all people, in here. Daniel Block, Philip Long. I mean, it's just a who's cast of amazing academic Bible thinkers. And this is going to give you the actual ancient Near Eastern context of the individual passages. So if you just want to read the Old Testament and be like, this is a weird thing. Why is this here? What's happening? You can read this, and it's full of resources to help you put it in the context in the ancient world. It's not going to give you any theological points. It's not going to give you any apologetics. It's just going to say, hey, here's the context. Here's what you need to know to understand this particular passage. So these are really, I think, really good volumes. And this is available electronically, and it's not even that expensive. You can get the whole 5-volume set for, I don't know what it runs for now, probably $250, $300.
And I just want to remind everybody real quick before we close, Justin's YouTube channel is called Deconstruction Zone. It's tagged in the description below. The link to it will also be in the pinned comment. And with that being said, Justin, thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Thanks, buddy. I had a blast.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.